In 1886, King Ludwig II of Bavaria stood inside a half-finished throne room built entirely on borrowed money, gold leaf drying on pillars he could no longer afford, while his ministers quietly drew up the paperwork to remove him from power. He had spent a kingdom's treasury on castles built for an audience of one. Within weeks he was dead, and the debts were real. History is full of people like him: emperors, heiresses, pirates, a boxer, a rapper, a king who filled a palace with a nation's shoes. Some of them earned unthinkable fortunes, some inherited them. All of them developed a habit around money, sustained past all reason, and every one of those habits eventually presented a bill. This is a collection of those habits and their bills. Nothing here is a lesson about your own finances, and nothing here is advice. We are simply watching, calmly, at a distance of centuries or decades, what certain people did with extraordinary amounts of money, and what it cost them in the end. Sometimes the cost was a throne, sometimes it was a son's leg, sometimes, strangely, there was no cost at all, and that turns out to be its own kind of lesson in human nature. 45 of them, drawn from 5 continents and 5,000 years, settle in. When Musa left his capital at Niani in 1324 to make the pilgrimage to Mecca, he brought with him a caravan historians still struggle to describe without sounding as though they are exaggerating. Thousands of attendants, servants dressed in fine cloth, and so much gold carried by camel that no chronicler ever recorded the exact quantity, only its effect. That effect showed up first in Cairo. Wherever Musa stopped, his habit was to give gold away, generously and constantly, to officials, holy men and ordinary people who simply asked. Egyptian chroniclers writing decades later remembered a city flooded with gold dust that could not be spent fast enough to matter, and a currency thrown so far out of balance that its value did not fully recover for years. One writer, Al-Makrizi, described the Cairo gold market still feeling the effects more than a decade on. Modern historians treat the outline of the story as well established, even where individual figures in the old accounts look rounded for effect. What makes the habit interesting is that it was never framed at the time as recklessness. Generosity on this scale was a demonstration of the wealth of Mali itself, and by extension its ruler, a kingdom built on gold mined far south along river systems that Musa's state carefully controlled and taxed. Giving that gold away in public rather than hoarding it was the entire point. A king who could depress the value of gold in the largest city in Africa through simple generosity was making an argument about his kingdom that no army could make as effectively. The habit carried a cost, just not the kind that shows up in a ledger. By some accounts of his return journey, Musa had to borrow gold at ruinous rates to make it home, a king briefly humbled by his own open hand in the very markets he had just upended. Cairo's memory of it outlived Mali. The necklace at the centre of one of the most famous financial scandals of the 18th century was never actually bought by the queen it destroyed. It had originally been commissioned for King Louis XV's mistress, an extravagant piece of jewellery so costly the crown jewellers could not find a buyer after the king died before paying for it. Years later, a con artist named Jean de la Motte convinced a cardinal, Louis de Rohan, that Marie Antoinette secretly wanted the necklace and would reward him handsomely for arranging its purchase on her behalf. She forged the queen's signature, staged a nighttime meeting with a prostitute dressed to resemble her, and walked away with the jewels, while Rohan believed he was doing the queen a discreet favour. When the fraud collapsed and the truth came out in a public trial in 1785, the fine legal detail hardly mattered to the French public. What mattered was that the story was believable at all, and it was believable because Marie Antoinette had a well-earned reputation for extraordinary personal spending, on gowns, on the private retreat of the Petit Trianon, on gambling debts at court. She had spent enough, visibly enough, for years that an entire country was ready to accept. She had ordered a fortune in diamonds on a whim, even though in this particular case she had not. The scandal did lasting damage regardless of the facts. Pamphlets across France used the affair to paint the Queen as a bottomless drain on a treasury already strained by war debts, cementing a public image that would follow her to the scaffold 8 years later. She never wore the necklace. She never needed to. By the time Mike Tyson filed for bankruptcy in 2003, he had earned somewhere in the range of $300 million across his boxing career, one of the largest sums any athlete of his era had made in the ring. The habit that undid it was not one purchase but a lifestyle sustained year after year at a scale that assumed the money would never stop arriving. Tyson kept a rotating fleet of luxury cars, some of which he reportedly drove only once. He maintained a large personal staff, kept exotic pets including Bengal tigers that required their own dedicated caretakers, and commissioned custom jewellery and clothing on a scale his own later interviews describe with a kind of bemused disbelief at himself. Court filings from the bankruptcy case detailed monthly expenses that ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, sustained during years when his career and his earnings were already declining. What makes Tyson's case distinct from a simple story of a spendthrift athlete is how openly he later discussed it. In interviews given well after the bankruptcy, he described the spending less as a series of individual bad decisions, and more as an identity he had built for himself, one where restraint would have felt like a betrayal of the persona that made him famous in the first place. Buying whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it, was not incidental to being Mike Tyson. For a long stretch of his life, it was the job description. The bankruptcy filing listed debts exceeding $27 million against assets that had once seemed limitless. The tigers went to an animal sanctuary. The cars were sold at auction, one after another, to buyers who had no idea which ones had ever left a driveway. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, working roughly a century after Cleopatra's death, recorded a story that has outlived almost everything else written about her wealth. A wager with Mark Antony over who could host the more extravagant dinner settled when Cleopatra removed one of a matched pair of enormous pearl earrings, dropped it into a cup of vinegar, waited for it to dissolve, and drank it down before Antony could stop her. Historians treat the story with real caution. Pliny wrote it as an illustration of Egyptian excess for a Roman audience already primed to see Cleopatra as decadent, and no contemporary source confirms the details. Vinegar strong enough to dissolve a pearl quickly would also have been unpleasant to drink, which has led some modern writers to wonder whether the pearl was crushed first, or whether the whole episode is closer to legend than record. What the story captures accurately, whether or not the pearl ever actually dissolved, is a genuine habit of the Ptolemaic court. Wealth deployed as theatre, Cleopatra's dinners, according to multiple ancient sources describing different occasions, involved gold dinnerware discarded after a single use, rooms redecorated overnight, and displays clearly designed to be talked about rather than simply enjoyed. In a diplomatic relationship where Egypt needed Rome to see it as a wealthy, worthy, and slightly dangerous partner rather than a conquest waiting to happen, extravagance was doing real political work. The habit was not really about the pearl. It was about making sure that whoever heard the story afterward understood exactly what Cleopatra was capable of throwing away without a second thought. The wager, at least, she is said to have won outright. After the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD cleared enormous stretches of the city, Emperor Nero did not simply rebuild. He claimed a large portion of the newly emptied land at the city's centre for himself, and began constructing a palace so vast and so gilded that Romans took to calling it the Musa Ureo, the Golden House. Contemporary accounts describe rooms with ceilings that could rotate, walls faced in gold leaf and precious stones, and grounds that included an artificial lake surrounded by pavilions, all built in the middle of a city, many of whose residents had just lost their homes to the same fire that cleared the land. A colossal bronze statue of Nero himself, over 100 feet tall, stood near the entrance. The optics were not lost on the Roman public, even at the time. Their emperor appeared to have converted a city-wide disaster into a private pleasure ground. The backlash outlasted Nero by decades. Within a few years of his death in 68 AD, his successor began systematically dismantling the Musa Ureo, stripping it of its precious materials, filling in its rooms with rubble, and eventually building the Colosseum on part of the site the artificial lake had once occupied. It was not merely abandoned. It was deliberately erased, a rare case in Roman history of a building's memory being treated as dangerous enough to bury on purpose. Archaeologists rediscovered fragments of the buried rooms, centuries later, their painted ceilings remarkably preserved by the very rubble that had been dumped over them in disgrace. The habit that built the palace, and the habit that destroyed it, turned out to leave roughly the same mark on history. What survives of the Golden House today is mostly what its enemies buried rather than what its builder finished. In the winter of 1636 and into early 1637, a single bulb of a rare striped tulip variety called Emper Augustus is documented in Dutch trading records as having changed hands for a sum comparable to a substantial canal house in Amsterdam, complete with courtyard and garden. The variety earned its price honestly, in a manner of speaking. Semper Augustus tulips displayed a striking red and white flame pattern caused, though no one at the time understood this, by a virus infecting the bulb. Because the pattern could not be reliably bred and appeared unpredictably, the very best specimens were genuinely rare, and Dutch merchants, flush with money from a booming trade economy, had both the means and the appetite to pay extraordinary sums for something no one else could easily. Modern historians, most notably in J. Gar, in her research on the period, caution against the popular version of this story that has ordinary Dutch tradesmen mortgaging their homes en masse for common bulbs, and then jumping into canals when the market collapsed in February 1637. The documented extreme prices belong almost entirely to rare varieties like Emper Augustus, traded among a relatively narrow circle of wealthy merchants and specialist growers. The wider social devastation often attached to the story appears, on closer archival examination, to be considerably exaggerated by later writers eager for a morality tale about greed. What is not exaggerated is the habit itself, buying not the flower in front of you, but the reputation and rarity attached to its name, sustained by a market where price had detached almost entirely from anything the object could actually do once it bloomed. The bulbs went back to being flowers. King Ludwig II of Bavaria never wanted to rule so much as he wanted to build, and by the 1880s his habit of commissioning increasingly elaborate private castles had produced a debt load his own ministers considered a threat to the stability of the crown itself. Neuschwanstein, the castle that would later inspire theme park design around the world, was funded almost entirely from Alo Ludwig's personal accounts and loans rather than the Bavarian state treasury, a distinction he insisted on maintaining even as the debts grew. He commissioned 2 more grand residences alongside it, each stuffed with elaborate murals, gilded interiors, and technological novelties for the era, built for a king who increasingly preferred the company of his own architectural fantasies to the company of his court. By the mid-1880s his creditors were pressing hard enough, and his personal behaviour had grown erratic enough that a group of ministers assembled a panel of doctors willing to declare him mentally unfit to rule, largely on the strength of testimony that never directly examined him. In June of 1886, Ludwig was deposed and taken into custody at Berg Castle on the shore of a Bavarian lake. The following night, he and the doctor overseeing him were both found dead in the shallow water nearby. The official explanation held that Ludwig drowned himself after killing his doctor in a struggle, though the shallow depth of the water at the reported location has left the exact circumstances debated by historians ever since. What is not debated is the debt. Ludwig had spent the equivalent of a substantial share of his personal fortune and borrowed heavily beyond it, all on buildings that ironically later became some of the most profitable tourist attractions in German history, earning back many times what they cost within a few generations of his death. He never saw a single tourist pass through the gates. The Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan began construction of the Taj Mahal in 1632, a mausoleum for his late wife Mumtaz Mahal, and sustained the project for roughly 2 decades using labour and materials drawn from across an empire that stretched over much of the Indian subcontinent. Historians are careful about quoting a precise final cost, since the surviving Mughal court records that mention figures are inconsistent, and were not kept with modern accounting in mind. What is well established is the scale of what was diverted toward the project. White marble transported from quarries hundreds of miles away, semi-precious stones inlaid by craftsmen brought from as far as Persia and Central Asia, and a sustained draw on the imperial treasury across the entire period of construction, layered on top of Shah Jahan's other extensive building projects in Delhi and Agra. The habit of monumental building for personal or dynastic memory was hardly unique to Shah Jahan among Mughal rulers, but he pursued it with unusual intensity, and several historians count the financial strain of his construction projects among the grievances his own son Aurangzeb later cited when he seized the throne in 1658, and placed his father under house arrest in Agra Fort for the remainder of his life. From a window there, Shah Jahan could reportedly see the white dome of the tomb he had built, without ever again having the freedom or the treasury to build anything else. The building outlasted the empire that built it by centuries, drawing millions of visitors a year long after the Mughal court itself had faded into history books. Shah Jahan is buried there now, beside the wife the tomb was built for. By 1716, France's treasury was drowning in debt from decades of war under Louis XIV, and the regent governing on behalf of the young Louis XV was desperate enough to hand extraordinary financial powers to a Scottish gambler and economist named John Law. Law's plan rested on two connected habits: issuing paper currency backed by confidence rather than metal, and channeling that confidence through shares in a company, the Mississippi Company, that held a monopoly on trade with France's territories in the Louisiana region of North America. The regent, eager for any solution that did not involve raising taxes on an already strained population, backed Law's paper money with the full authority of the state and allowed him to merge the currency system with the trading company almost entirely. Share prices in the Mississippi Company rose at a pace that had little to do with any actual profits arriving from Louisiana, which in reality was producing far less wealth than investors imagined. Ordinary Parisians who had never owned a financial instrument in their lives crowded the narrow Rue Quincampoix to buy in, some reportedly making and losing fortunes within the same week as prices swung wildly. When confidence finally cracked in 1720, investors rushed to convert both shares and paper money back into metal coin, and the system, having no metal reserve remotely large enough to cover what it had issued, collapsed within months. The regent's habit of reaching for a financial solution rather than a fiscal one had solved an immediate crisis by creating a much larger one. Law fled France in disguise. France's appetite for paper currency, and for financial innovation generally, would remain damaged for the better part of a century. The territory the whole scheme was named for never delivered anything close to what its shares had promised. The South Sea Company was granted a monopoly on British trade with Spanish America in 1711, a trade that in practice delivered far less profit than its charter implied, and yet by the spring of 1720 its share price in London had risen to roughly 10 times what it had been only months before. The habit that drove the price was almost entirely social. As shares climbed, more people bought simply because everyone around them seemed to be getting rich, a pattern that pulled in members of Parliament, aristocrats and merchants alike, all convinced that whatever the company was actually doing mattered less than the fact that its stock kept rising. Isaac Newton, already the most celebrated scientist in England, and no stranger to careful reasoning, bought shares early, sold them for a solid profit, and then, watching the price continue to climb after he had cashed out, bought back in near the peak. When the bubble burst that autumn, Newton is reported to have lost a substantial sum, reportedly remarking afterward that he could calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. Parliament, several of whose own members had taken bribes to support the company's schemes, passed a law that same year restricting the formation of new joint stock companies, an attempt to prevent a repeat that would shape British corporate law for the following century. The company itself survived in a reduced form for decades afterward, a quiet administrative shell of the institution that had briefly convinced half of London it had found a permanent machine for turning paper into gold. Newton kept the equations, he just never got the money back. In the New York of the 1880s, the surest way for a family with new money to prove it belonged among old money was to host a ball so extravagant that it could not be ignored, and for roughly a decade the city's wealthiest families competed at exactly that, with the ballroom as the battlefield. The costume ball hosted in 1883 by Alva Vanderbilt is often cited as the moment the competition reached a genuine peak, a lavish evening that reportedly cost well over $100,000 in the money of the day, with guests arriving in commissioned costumes representing historical figures, and an entire wing of the Vanderbilt mansion built specifically to house the event. The ball's real purpose had little to do with entertainment. The Vanderbilts, whose fortune came from railroads rather than old colonial bloodlines, had struggled for years to be accepted by New York's established society, led socially by figures like Caroline Astor. A ball this overwhelming was difficult for Mrs. Astor's circle to simply decline to attend, and attending amounted to a kind of social surrender. The habit spread outward from there. Rival families spent competitively on their own events for years afterward, each trying to outdo the last in scale, cost and theatrical detail, producing a running social ledger where the guest list mattered as much as the money spent, and the money spent existed largely to secure the guest list. Contemporary newspapers covered these events, with the detail usually reserved for state occasions, feeding a public fascination with a class of Americans, spending at a scale most of the country could not conceive of. The unofficial list of who counted as society, known simply as the 400, after the rough number the Astor Ballroom could comfortably hold, outlived every one of the balls that built it. The ballrooms themselves were mostly demolished within a generation. William Randolph Hearst began building his estate at San Simeon on the California coast in 1919 and never really stopped, adding wings, guest cottages, and an ever-expanding collection of European antiques and artwork for close to 3 decades, funded largely by the profits of his newspaper empire. The habit was collecting as much as it was building. Hearst bought entire rooms shipped whole from European castles and monasteries, acquired artwork with little regard for whether it matched the estate's existing style, and kept construction crews on site continuously, often altering finished sections almost as soon as they were completed. By the 1930s, with newspaper advertising revenue collapsing during the Depression and Hearst's debts from decades of acquisition finally catching up with him, his financial advisors forced a painful reckoning. Large portions of his art collection had to be sold off, and a corporate trust was created to take control of his business empire out of his own hands, to prevent him from spending it into total collapse. Hearst kept building at San Simeon even during the worst of this financial crisis, on a reduced scale, unable it seemed to fully let go of the habit, even as his advisors worked to save what remained of his fortune. Construction on the estate was never formally finished. Guest cottages remain unbuilt to this day exactly where Hearst's plans left them. He died in 1951, having spent decades accumulating a private collection that would eventually be handed over to the state of California as a museum, viewed today by more people in a single year than ever saw it, while Hearst himself was alive to show it off. The house he built to impress his contemporaries now mostly hosts strangers. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877, he had amassed a fortune from shipping and railroads that made him, by most estimates, the wealthiest man in America. By 1973, when roughly 120 descendants gathered at Vanderbilt University for a family reunion, not a single one of them was wealthy enough to appear on any list of America's richest people. The habit that dissolved the fortune was not one bad decision, but a whole culture of decisions repeated across 3 generations. Cornelius' son and grandsons built an extraordinary run of Fifth Avenue mansions and Newport summer cottages, homes with dozens of rooms staffed by dozens of servants, maintained at costs that assumed the family's railroad income would simply continue rising indefinitely. It did not. Railroads faced increasing regulation and competition through the early 20th century, even as the family's spending habits, built around an earlier era of unlimited growth, barely adjusted. Inheritances were split repeatedly among growing numbers of heirs, each portion shrinking with each generation, while the habit of maintaining an extravagant lifestyle passed down largely intact, even as the money to support it thinned. The Breakers and Marble House, 2 of the family's Newport mansions, still stand today, now maintained as museums by a historical preservation society rather than by any Vanderbilt. Visitors' tour rooms built to display a wealth the family itself no longer established. The fortune did not vanish through any single dramatic collapse. It simply outspent its own income, generation after generation, until there was no fortune left to outspend. The name remained famous. The money did not. Barbara Hutton was 5 years old when she inherited a substantial share of the Woolworth 5 and dime store fortune following her mother's death, and by the time she came of age in the 1930s, newspapers had already taken to calling her the poor little rich girl, a nickname that stuck for the rest of her life. Hutton's habit was constant, generous spending across every part of her life, on jewellery, on real estate spanning several countries, on lavish gifts to each of her 7 husbands and to friends who often took advantage of her generosity, and on a lifestyle that assumed, much like the Vanderbilts before her, that the fortune behind it was effectively bottomless. It was not. Between the divorces, which frequently came with substantial settlements paid by Hutton herself rather than to her, staff salaries maintained across multiple residences, and an ongoing habit of impulsive purchases, her share of the once vast retail fortune shrank steadily across her adult life. By the time she died in 1979, Hutton's estate was reportedly a small fraction of what she had once controlled, having spent through an inheritance that had made headlines for its size when she first received it as a child. Friends and biographers who knew her in her final years described someone who never seemed to fully register that the money could actually run out, having never once in her life needed to think about it before it started to. She had been given a fortune before she was old enough to understand what one was, and she spent much of her adult life discovering, piece by piece, what having one had never taught her. The dime store chain outlived her fortune by decades. At his commercial peak in 1990, MC Hammer's album Please Hammer Do Not, Hurt M had sold over 10 million copies, and he was reportedly earning in the neighborhood of $33 million, an extraordinary sum for a performer barely into his late 20s. The habit that undid the fortune was not a single reckless purchase, but the ongoing cost of maintaining a life scaled to those peak earnings after the peak had passed. Hammer built a large mansion in Fremont, California, complete with a home recording studio, and kept a substantial personal staff on payroll, along with a large touring entourage that continued at close to full size even as his record sales began to decline through the early 1990s. He later described, in interviews given years afterward, monthly overhead running into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, an amount that had made sense when the hits kept coming and made progressively less sense as they slowed. By 1996, with income no longer matching outgoing costs that had never really adjusted downward, Hammer filed for bankruptcy, listing debts that ran into the millions. He was notably candid about the cause in later years, describing the upkeep of the mansion and its staff as the specific habit that had outpaced everything else, rather than any single indulgent purchase. Hammer rebuilt a career afterward in ministry, business and entertainment, and spoke openly about the experience as a cautionary story about scale, rather than about any particular vice. The mansion was eventually sold. The habit of maintaining it, he later said, was the part he wished he had questioned sooner. Michael Jackson purchased the property that would become Neverland Ranch in 1988, and over the following years transformed it into a private estate, complete with a functioning amusement park, a zoo housing exotic animals, and a full-time staff to maintain all of it, at a cost that continued regardless of whether the property was occupied. The ranch was one piece of a broader spending habit that persisted across Jackson's later career. Extensive art and collectible purchases, real estate held simultaneously in multiple countries, and a personal staff and security apparatus maintained at a scale suited to his peak earning years, even as record sales and touring income became less predictable through the 1990s and 2000s. By the time of his death in 2009, reporting on his estate described debts that ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars, accumulated across years in which the ongoing cost of maintaining his lifestyle, Neverland chief among the expenses, had outpaced income that was itself still substantial by almost any ordinary measure. What makes Jackson's case notable is the scale mismatch. Even extraordinary earnings, sustained across a long career, proved insufficient against upkeep costs that never meaningfully contracted even during years when income did. Neverland itself sat largely unused for long stretches in his final years, while the ranch's staff, utilities and maintenance continued regardless. An entire property run at full operating cost for an audience of essentially no one. His estate, managed after his death by professional executors rather than by Jackson himself, eventually paid down the debts through licensing and posthumous earnings that exceeded what he had generated in several of his final years combined. Neverland was sold in 2020, its rides and zoo enclosures long since emptied. At the height of his film earnings in the early 2000s, Nicolas Cage was reportedly taking home tens of millions of dollars a year, and his purchasing habits during that period read like a list assembled without any organizing theme at all. He bought a castle in Germany. He bought another property in Rhode Island once owned by a horror novelist he admired, along with an island in the Bahamas. Among the more widely reported purchases was a rare dinosaur skull, a Tyrannosaurus bataar, bought at auction in 2007 for a sum in the hundreds of thousands of dollars after outbidding the actor Leonardo DiCaprio for it. Years later, federal investigators determined the skull had been illegally excavated and smuggled out of Mongolia, and Cage voluntarily surrendered it for return to the Mongolian government once he learned its true origin, a rare case in this list of an extravagant purchase resolved with something like grace. By 2009, with a string of these acquisitions layered atop real estate taxes, staff and mortgage obligations across multiple properties, Cage's finances had deteriorated enough that he sued his own financial manager, alleging mismanagement while simultaneously facing tax liens reported to total several $1,000,000. He later described the period candidly in interviews, framing the purchases less as investments and more as impulses. He had simply never developed the habit of questioning, given how long the money had kept arriving without apparent limit. Cage worked steadily and prolifically in the years that followed, in part, by his own account, specifically to pay down what the collecting habit had cost him. The dinosaur skull, at least, made it home. In 2017, Johnny Depp filed a lawsuit against his longtime business management firm, alleging mismanagement of his finances, and in the process of that lawsuit, and the countersuit that followed, a remarkably detailed picture emerged of exactly how an actor earning tens of millions of dollars a film could still end up in serious financial trouble. Court filings and subsequent reporting described spending that included a large personal staff maintained across multiple residences, an extensive wine collection, and payments related to island property in the Bahamas, alongside more idiosyncratic habits like a reported fondness for firing cannons loaded with the ashes of the writer Hunter S. Thompson at a memorial Depp funded. His own management firm countered in their filings that Depp's spending habits, not their advice, were the actual source of the financial strain, pointing to monthly expenditures that dwarfed even his substantial film income during years when his box office draw had begun to decline. What makes the case useful as a habit study, distinct from simple celebrity gossip, is how much of it existed in the record rather than in rumour. The specific figures cited in court, whatever their exact accuracy, described upkeep costs, staff and property maintained continuously regardless of income, echoing the same pattern that undid MC Hammer's fortune decades earlier under very different circumstances. The scale of income involved did not change the shape of the underlying habit. The lawsuits were eventually settled, with both sides claiming some vindication in the details that had already become public regardless of the outcome. The wine, by most accounts, was very good. The silver deposits discovered at Potosi, high in the mountains of what is now Bolivia, produced such an enormous share of the world's silver supply through the 16th and 17th centuries that the Spanish crown came to treat the shipments arriving from the Americas as a routine, almost guaranteed source of income against which it could borrow freely. That habit of borrowing against future silver, rather than living within what had already arrived, defined Spanish royal finance for generations. The crown financed wars across Europe, from conflicts with France to the long struggle to hold the Netherlands, largely on credit extended by bankers who assumed the silver fleets would eventually make everything whole. The silver did keep arriving, in genuinely staggering quantities mined using forced indigenous and later enslaved labour under brutal conditions at Potosi itself. It simply never arrived in quantities that matched the pace of the spending it was expected to cover. The result was one of the more counterintuitive patterns in financial history. A crown sitting atop what was, for a period, likely the largest silver supply any state had ever controlled, and still defaulting on its debts multiple times in 1557, 1575, 1596, 1607, and 1647, each default triggered by spending commitments that had outrun even an extraordinary and continuous flow of precious metal. Bankers in Genoa and Antwerp, who had extended credit against the promise of silver shipments, frequently found themselves ruined by a default from a crown that, on paper, controlled more mineral wealth than any government in the world. Potosi's mines continued producing for generations after the crown's borrowing habits had already bankrupted it more than once. The mountain locals said 8 men and gave back silver. It gave back rather less to the treasury that spent it before it arrived. The Roman denarius, first minted in the 3rd century BC, began its life as a coin of nearly pure silver, trusted and stable enough to circulate across the entire Mediterranean world for generations without much comment on its actual metal content. Over roughly the next 2 centuries, successive emperors developed a quiet, recurring habit. Rather than raise taxes outright to cover the costs of wars, donatives to soldiers, and public spectacles meant to secure their popularity, they simply reduced the amount of actual silver in each coin while keeping its face value, and its face unchanged. Nero's reign saw an early reduction. Later emperors, facing greater military pressures on the empire's frontiers, pushed the debasement much further, until by the middle of the 3rd century AD, the denarius contained only a small fraction of the silver it had once held, its surface silvered over a base metal core to disguise how little precious metal remained inside. The habit worked in the narrow sense that it let emperors keep spending without the political cost of a visible tax increase. It failed in every broader sense that mattered. Prices across the empire began rising as merchants and soldiers realized the coins they were being paid in were worth less than they claimed to be, a slow-building inflation that historians consider one of several contributing pressures on the Roman economy during the empire's 3rd century crisis. Trust, once eroded coin by coin across 2 centuries of quiet reductions, proved far harder to rebuild than it had been to spend away in the first place. Emperor Diocletian's later currency reforms, and further reforms under Constantine, eventually stabilized the system on a new footing, decades after the original habit had already done its damage. The coins kept their faces, only the silver left. The Histor iu Augusta, a collection of Roman imperial biographies written well over a century after the events it describes, records a striking claim about the teenage emperor Elugabulus, who ruled Rome from 218 to 222 AD, that he once had so many flower petals released from a false ceiling above a banquet that at least one guest reportedly suffocated, unable to find their way out from beneath the drifting mass. Modern historians treat the Histor iu Auguste as an unreliable source on its best day, prone to inventing scandalous anecdotes to entertain its readers and discredit emperors its author disliked. And Elagabdlus, a teenage outsider from Syria who scandalized Roman religious and social sensibilities during his brief reign, was exactly the kind of figure the text loved to exaggerate. The Petals story may never have happened at all, or may be a wild embellishment of some smaller, genuinely lavish banquet. What is better attested, across sources with somewhat more credibility, is a general pattern of extraordinary spending on entertainment and display during Elagabulus' short reign, elaborate banquets, extravagant gifts to favourites, and religious ceremonies staged with a theatrical excess that alienated the Roman Senate and the Praetorian Guard, whose support any emperor needed to survive. That alienation proved fatal. In 222 AD, Elagabulus and his mother were murdered by the Praetorian Guard, in a coup that installed his young cousin as emperor in his place, ending a reign that had lasted barely 4 years. Whether or not any single guest ever actually drowned beneath a ceiling of petals, the underlying habit the story was invented, or exaggerated, to illustrate extravagance divorced entirely from political judgment, cost Elagabulus his throne and his life regardless. The Petals, real or invented, made for a better story than the coup that followed them. Rahim the first came to the Ottoman throne in 1640. After spending much of his adult life confined to a section of the palace reserved for potential heirs the reigning Sultan considered a threat, and his 8 years of rule that followed were marked, according to contemporary Ottoman chroniclers, by a habit of lavish, almost compulsive gift-giving to court favourites, particularly within his large harem. Accounts from the period describe enormous sums directed toward jewellery, furs, and luxury goods for favoured companions, along with elaborate ceremonial gifts and appointments handed out with little regard for the state's actual finances, at a time when the Ottoman treasury was already under considerable strain from ongoing military campaigns. Grand viziers who attempted to restrain the spending, or advise more careful management of state funds, reportedly found themselves quickly replaced, a pattern that left the empire's actual administrators unable to meaningfully check the habit, even when they recognized its cost. The financial strain became entangled with broader political discontent. By 1648, a coalition of religious authorities, palace officials, and the Janissary Corps, the empire's elite military guard, had accumulated enough grievances, financial mismanagement chief among them, to move against Ibn Rahim directly. He was deposed and, within days, executed by strangulation, a common method for removing Ottoman rulers considered too dangerous to leave alive even in confinement. His young son, Mehmed IV, succeeded him at only 6 years old, leaving the actual work of stabilizing the treasury to a series of regents and grand viziers who spent years repairing finances that Ibn Rahim's habits had strained considerably during his brief reign. The gifts outlived the giver by decades. The giver did not outlive them by more than a few years. Shah Jahan, the same Mughal emperor whose spending built the Taj Mahal, also commissioned a golden throne so elaborate with gems that contemporary accounts describe its construction as taking roughly 7 years to complete, incorporating hundreds of precious stones including, according to most historical accounts, the gem later known as the Koh-i-Noor diamond. The peacock throne, named for the 2 jewelled peacock figures that flanked its canopy, became one of the most visible symbols of Mughal imperial wealth for over a century after its completion around 1635, used in formal court ceremonies to project the dynasty's power to visiting ambassadors and subjects alike. Its value, even by contemporary estimates that historians treat with appropriate caution, given the era's habit of rounding upward for effect, was reckoned as considerably greater than the cost of the Taj Mahal itself. That visible wealth eventually attracted exactly the kind of attention Mughal emperors had spent generations trying to project confidence against rather than invite. In 1739, the Persian ruler Najd Shah invaded northern India, sacked Delhi, and among the spoils he carried back to Persia was the peacock throne itself, along with the Koh-i-Noor and vast quantities of other treasure accumulated across more than a century of Mughal rule. The throne was reportedly broken up, and its individual jewels dispersed within Persia not long after, following political turmoil there, meaning the object itself did not survive intact for very much longer even in its new home. The Mughal court never fully recovered its treasury or its prestige after the loss. The empire itself entered a long, uneven decline across the following century. The throne that had been built to announce an empire's wealth to the world ended up announcing just as clearly when that wealth had become a target. Between 1536 and 1541, King Henry VIII of England oversaw the dissolution of England's monasteries, seizing land, buildings and treasure that had accumulated in religious institutions across the country over centuries, in what historians generally regard as one of the largest single transfers of wealth in English history, up to that point. The habit that followed the windfall was almost immediate spending rather than lasting accumulation. Proceeds from the seized monastic lands and treasures were sold off or granted to loyal nobles at a rapid pace, and the crown poured a considerable share of the resulting income into renewed wars with France and Scotland during the 1540s, along with an extensive program of coastal fortifications and palace building. Rather than using the monastic wealth to establish a durable financial cushion for the crown, as some of his own advisors had reportedly hoped, Henry treated it largely as available cash for immediate priorities, much of it military. By the time Henry died in 1547, despite having absorbed one of the largest windfalls any English monarch had ever received, the crown's finances were in a precarious state, weighed down by ongoing war costs and a currency that had itself been debased during the same period, to help cover expenses echoing, on a smaller island a millennium and a half later, the same habit that had once hollowed out the Roman denarius. His successors inherited both a diminished treasury and a debased coinage that took years of subsequent reform to stabilize. The monasteries themselves, many stripped down to their stone foundations for building material, remained as ruins scattered across the English countryside for centuries afterward, silent evidence of just how much had briefly passed through the crown's hands. The wealth had been extraordinary. The habit of spending it as quickly as it arrived proved considerably more durable than the wealth itself. Cardinal Wolsey, King Henry VIII's most powerful minister through the 1510s and 1520s, accumulated enormous personal wealth through church offices and royal favour, and spent a considerable share of it building Hampton Court Palace on the Thames outside London into one of the grandest residences in England. The habit reflected Wolsey's broader approach to power, matching, and in some particulars exceeding, the visible splendour of the king he served. Hampton Court featured hundreds of rooms, elaborately decorated state apartments, and a level of luxury that contemporary observers frequently compared, not always favourably for Henry, to the king's own palaces. For a churchman who had risen from relatively modest origins to become the second most powerful man in England, a residence that could rival royal architecture was itself a kind of habit of self-presentation, not unlike Nero's Golden House built to announce a status that words alone could not fully convey. The comparison eventually became a political liability rather than a private indulgence. As Wolsey's other troubles mounted, chiefly his failure to secure the Pope's approval for Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, The visible extravagance of Hampton Court became one more point held against him at court. In 1529, likely recognising which way the political wind was blowing, Wolsey formally gave Hampton Court to Henry as a gift, hoping to repair the relationship before it deteriorated further. The gesture did not save him. Wolsey was stripped of his political offices later that year and died in 1530 while travelling to face charges of treason, a fall from grace nearly as dramatic as the ascent that had preceded it. Hampton Court remained a royal palace for centuries afterward. Wolsey's name is remembered there mostly as the man who built it and then had to hand it over. The Medici Bank, founded in Florence in the late 14th century, grew over the following decades into one of the largest and most respected financial institutions in Europe, in no small part through a habit of extending substantial credit to popes, kings and princes who offered political influence in return for access to Medici money. Lending to the papacy in particular became a defining and eventually dangerous part of the bank's business. Medici branches managed papal finances and extended loans secured more by the prestige and connections such lending brought than by any conventional collateral. The habit worked well for generations, cementing the family's rise from bankers to the effective rulers of Florence and eventually producing several actual popes from within the family itself. It also meant the bank's fortunes were tied to borrowers who were, in the end, sovereign rulers largely immune to the ordinary consequences of default. Cracks appeared first at the bank's branches furthest from Florentine oversight. The London branch collapsed in the 1470s after King Edward IV defaulted on enormous loans extended to fund his wars, a default the bank had no real means of enforcing repayment against. The Bruges branch failed under similar pressures not long after. By the time the Medici family lost control of Florence itself in 1494, amid political upheaval and the bank's accumulated bad debts from decades of lending to increasingly unreliable rulers, the institution that had once been the most powerful bank in Europe was a shadow of what it had been. The habit of lending to power, rather than to more mundane and more reliably solvent borrowers, had built the family's fortune. The same habit, sustained past the point where the risks still made sense, helped unwind it. The Medici name endured in art and politics for centuries. The bank that had first made that name possible did not. The Fugger family of Augsburg built one of the largest banking fortunes in 16th century Europe, and in 1519 that fortune bought something few private banking families before them had ever purchased outright. An emperor, Jakob Fugger, extended an enormous loan alongside a smaller contribution from the rival Welser banking family to secure the votes of the electors who would choose the next Holy Roman Emperor, ensuring the selection of Charles V over the King of France, who had also been actively bidding for the position through his own financial backers. It was less a bribe in the crude sense than an established, if extraordinary, feature of the imperial election system at the time, where financial support for the winning candidate's campaign was simply how the process worked. The habit of extending credit at this scale to secure this kind of influence had made the Fuggers essential to European politics rather than merely wealthy. The risk embedded in that habit became apparent over subsequent decades. Charles V and his successors in the sprawling Habsburg territories continued borrowing heavily from the Fuggers to fund near constant wars across Europe, debts that were repaid unevenly, delayed repeatedly, and in some cases never fully settled at all. The family's later generations, having inherited both the fortune and the habit of extending credit to the same overextended dynasty, found the bank's financial position steadily eroding across the following century, as Habsburg debts accumulated faster than they were repaid. By the early 17th century, the Fugger banking empire that had once helped select an emperor had contracted significantly, its fortunes tied for too long to borrowers whose need for money never seemed to shrink. The family that once financed emperors spent much of the following century simply waiting to be paid back. When Peter the Great began constructing his palace complex at Peterhof, outside the newly founded city of St. Petersburg in the early 18th century, he was pursuing a deliberate habit of demonstration, proving to the established courts of Western Europe that Russia belonged among them, built through fountains, gilded facades, and formal gardens modelled closely on Versailles itself. The habit's cost fell almost entirely on people who never saw a fountain run. Peter's building projects, at Peterhof and across his broader effort, to construct St. Petersburg as a new capital from largely undeveloped marshland relied heavily on conscripted labour drawn from Russia's serf population and on heavy taxation levied specifically to fund the state's grand construction ambitions. Thousands of labourers worked under harsh conditions, with mortality on some of Peter's major building projects, particularly the founding of St. Petersburg itself, reaching levels that later historians have described as staggering even by the standards of the era. The palace succeeded at its intended purpose. Peterhof, completed and expanded across Peter's reign and those of his successors, did become a genuine showpiece capable of rivaling the grandest courts of Western Europe, helping cement Russia's status as a major European power in the eyes of foreign observers who toured its fountains and gardens. The habit of funding that display through labour and taxation, extracted from an already impoverished serf population, however, left a domestic legacy considerably less admired than the palace's foreign reputation. Peterhof survived Peter the Great by centuries, rebuilt after severe damage during the Second World War, and maintained today as one of Russia's most visited historical sites. The fountains still run. The labour that built them left no comparable monument. Port Royal, Jamaica, in the latter half of the 17th century developed a reputation, richly documented in contemporary accounts and later historical research, as one of the wealthiest and most reckless towns in the Caribbean, built almost entirely on a single recurring habit: pirate crews spending their plunder as fast as they could bring it ashore. Henry Morgan, whose raids against Spanish colonial targets made him one of the era's most successful privateers before he was eventually knighted and appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, operated within a broader culture where crews openly expected to spend an entire haul within weeks of returning to port on drink, gambling, and short-lived luxury, rather than save or invest any meaningful portion of it. Ship's articles governing how plunder was divided among crew members were often meticulously fair and detailed, a habit of careful accounting that stood in sharp contrast to what most of the men did with their individual shares once ashore. Contemporary accounts describe taverns and gambling houses in Port Royal doing extraordinary business immediately after a successful raiding crew returned, followed by comparatively quiet stretches until the next ship came in. The habit made a certain rough sense given the underlying risk. Piracy carried genuinely high mortality from combat, disease, and the ever-present possibility of capture and execution, and crews operating with that kind of life expectancy had comparatively little practical incentive toward long-term financial planning that assumed a comfortable old age most of them had no real reason to expect. Port Royal itself was largely destroyed by a devastating earthquake in 1692, a disaster many contemporaries, with a certain moralizing satisfaction, described as a fitting end for a town built on exactly this kind of spending. The plunder rarely lasted the season. Neither, often enough, did the men who spent it. Giacomo Casanovu's own memoirs, written late in his life and covering decades of travel across 18th century Europe, describe a habit that ran alongside his considerably more famous romantic exploits. A persistent, restless appetite for gambling that produced debts he seemed to accumulate almost as reliably as he accumulated lovers. Casanova's memoirs recount card games at courts and gambling houses from Venice to Paris to St. Petersburg, describing wins substantial enough to fund extended periods of travel and comfortable living, followed reliably by losses that erased those same winnings within weeks or months. The pattern repeated across the decades his memoirs cover: a run of good fortune at the tables, a period of genuine wealth and social standing that followed, and then a collapse back into debt that frequently forced him to depend on the generosity of patrons, lovers, or simply his own considerable talent for talking his way out of difficulty, before the cycle began again in a new city. What makes Casanova's own account of the habit distinct from most of the other figures in this list is his apparent lack of regret about it. Writing his memoirs near the end of his life, largely in genteel poverty as a librarian in Bohemia, Casanova described the gambling less as a flaw to be explained away, and more as simply one more feature of a life he had deliberately organized around risk and appetite in every direction available to him, financial risk included. He died in 1798, having spent much of the fortune various patrons and lovers had helped him accumulate across a lifetime spent moving between courts one step ahead of his own debts. The cards, by his own account, had been exactly as central to his life as the romances everyone remembered him for. Louis XIV deliberately reorganized French court life around the Palace of Versailles in the late 17th century, requiring the kingdom's nobility to spend extended periods in residence near him rather than governing independently from their own regional estates. A concentrated power at court, but also imposed an enormous, largely unavoidable financial burden on the nobles it applied to. Proximity to the king came with an unspoken but rigidly enforced habit of expenditure. Nobles at Versailles were expected to dress, entertain, and present themselves at a standard set by the wealthiest members of the court, regardless of their own family's actual income, since visible frugality risked being read as a lack of respect for the king or a sign of declining favour, either of which could damage a family's standing far more than the debt itself. Wardrobes had to be constantly refreshed to match shifting court fashion. Gambling at court was practically obligatory as a social activity, and maintaining appropriate lodging and staff near the palace added ongoing costs, layered on top of whatever a noble family's actual estates were producing back home. The result, well documented in the financial records and correspondence of numerous noble families from the period, was a court aristocracy that was, on paper, extraordinarily privileged, and in practice frequently drowning in debt, borrowing against future inheritances, or selling off portions of ancestral land, simply to maintain the appearance the king's court required of them. Unlike most of the other figures in this list, many of these nobles had little real choice in the matter. Opting out of the spending meant risking a much larger loss. Influence, marriage prospects, and royal favour that could make or break an entire family's fortunes for generations. Versailles concentrated French political power for over a century. It also quietly bankrupted a considerable share of the nobility required to inhabit it. The Sun King never had to spend a single livre keeping up appearances. Everyone standing near him did. George Brian Brummel, known to history simply as Beau Boon Brummel, rose from relatively modest origins to become the defining arbiter of men's fashion in Regency-era London, a position he maintained less through wealth of his own than through an extraordinary and expensive habit of personal presentation sustained on credit. Brummel's approach to dress, understated by the standards of his era but demanding an obsessive attention to tailoring, fabric and fit, required a continuous flow of money he did not reliably have. He ran up substantial debts with tailors who extended him, credit largely because his personal endorsement of their work was itself valuable enough to be worth the risk, alongside gambling debts accumulated at London's fashionable clubs, where his social standing, rather than his actual finances, secured him a seat at the table. For years the arrangement held Brummel's reputation functioning as a kind of currency that kept real creditors patient. The arrangement collapsed once Brummel's relationship with the Prince Regent, later King George IV, soured following a public falling out between the two men in 1813. Without royal favour to reinforce his social standing, Brummel's creditors grew considerably less patient, and by 1816 his debts had become serious enough that he fled England for Calais in France to escape arrest, never to return to the country whose fashion he had spent over a decade defining. He lived out his remaining years in France in increasingly reduced circumstances, eventually suffering from illness and confined poverty, and died in 1840 in an asylum for the indigent in Cannes, largely forgotten by the London society that had once dressed to match his standards. The habit that had made him famous required an audience willing to extend him credit indefinitely. Once that audience turned away, so did everyone who had been lending to him on the strength of his reputation alone. King Farouk of Egypt, who ruled from 1936 until his overthrow in 1952, developed over his reign a habit of collecting that went well beyond ordinary royal acquisitiveness, encompassing rare stamps, coins and pocket watches, some obtained through entirely conventional purchase and others according to numerous documented accounts, simply taken from guests or acquaintances whose belongings caught his attention. Contemporaries and later biographers described Farouk's collecting as bordering on outright kleptomania, with reports of the king lifting small valuable items directly from the pockets of people he was meeting, including at least one widely repeated account involving a ceremonial sword belonging to the visiting Shah of Iran. Whatever the precise accuracy of individual anecdotes, the broader pattern of compulsive acquisition, combined with a personal lifestyle increasingly seen by ordinary Egyptians as decadent and disconnected from a population dealing with poverty in the aftermath of a lost war against the newly formed State of Israel, steadily eroded whatever public support Farrok's monarchy still retained. Military officers led by Gamal Abdel Nasser overthrew Farrokh in a coup in July 1952, sending him into exile in Italy along with a fraction of the possessions he had spent decades accumulating. The new Egyptian government subsequently auctioned off much of what remained of his collections in 1954, an event that drew international attention and set records at the time for the sheer scale and variety of items involved, from rare stamps to ornate snuff boxes to entire collections of aphrodisiacs. The auction catalogue listed with a certain bureaucratic bluntness. Farrokh lived out his remaining years in Italy in comfortable but diminished circumstances, dying in Rome in 1965. He had spent a reign collecting objects that outlasted his throne by only a couple of years before an entire government decided what they were worth without him. When Ferdinand and Ishmeldu Marcos fled the Philippines for Hawaii in February of 1986, ousted after decades in power by a mass popular uprising, journalists and officials who entered the presidential palace in Manila in the following days found, among an extraordinary quantity of jewellery, art and designer clothing, a room reported to contain by some counts nearly 3,000 pairs of shoes belonging to Ishmeldu Marcos. The precise figure has been repeated so widely in the decades since that it has taken on something close to folklore, and Imelda Marcos herself later disputed the exact number in various interviews, though she never denied maintaining an extensive shoe collection, framing it instead as a personal passion rather than evidence of anything improper. What is not seriously disputed is the broader context surrounding the collection. The Marcos family's wealth, accumulated across 2 decades of rule during a period widely documented by international investigators and later Philippine court proceedings, as involving large-scale corruption, stood in stark and widely publicized contrast to poverty rates among ordinary Filipinos that had remained stubbornly high throughout the same period. The shoes became, almost immediately, a global shorthand for a much larger story about how extravagant personal habits at the top of a government could coexist for decades with genuine hardship for the population that government governed. Some of the shoe collection was later preserved and displayed at a museum in Marikina City, a curious afterlife for objects that had briefly become one of the most recognizable symbols of the excesses of the Marcos era. Imelda Marcos returned to the Philippines years later and remained a prominent, if controversial, public figure until her death in 2025. The palace room is empty now. The number of shoes it once held remains, depending on who is asked, either an exact fact or an exaggeration nobody involved has ever fully settled. Beginning in 1885, the Russian imperial family established a tradition, continued almost every year until 1917, of commissioning an elaborately jewelled Easter egg from the house of Fabergé, each one more intricate than the last, containing hidden surprises, miniature mechanisms, or tiny portraits concealed within surfaces of gold, enamel, and precious stones. The habit began as a personal gift from Tsar Alexander III to his wife, Empress Maria Feodorovna, and continued under his son Nicholas II, who commissioned eggs for both his mother and his own wife, Empress Alexandra, each year, regardless of the broader state of the Russian economy or the political mood of the country. Fabergé's workshop produced these commissions with growing elaborateness across 3 decades, even as Russia endured a disastrous war with Japan in 1904 and 1905, a failed revolution in 1905 itself, and mounting economic strain among a peasant population that made up the overwhelming majority of the empire's subjects. The tradition continued, remarkably, right up until the final year of the dynasty's existence. Fabergé is generally believed to have produced eggs for the imperial family for the 1917 Easter season, the same year the February Revolution forced Nicholas II's abdication, and the subsequent October Revolution installed a Bolshevik government that would eventually order the execution of the entire imperial family the following year. Some of the final eggs from this period were reportedly never even delivered before the revolution overtook the court that had commissioned them. The eggs themselves survived far better than the family that ordered them, scattered afterward into museum collections and private hands across the world, several eventually resurfacing at auction for sums that dwarfed even their considerable original cost. The imperial habit of commissioning them each Easter simply stopped, in the end, not because anyone decided it should, but because there was no longer an empire left to keep the tradition going. Andrew Carnegie built one of the largest personal fortunes in American history through the steel industry over the second half of the 19th century, and then, having sold his steel holdings in 1901 for a sum equivalent to a substantial share of the entire United States federal budget of the time, spent the remaining 18 years of his life developing a habit almost nobody else in this list shares, giving as much of it away as he possibly could before he died. Carnegie had written an essay years earlier, widely known as the Gospel of Wealth, arguing that a rich man who died with his fortune largely intact had, in his own words, died disgraced, and he spent the final chapter of his own life acting deliberately on that belief. He funded the construction of more than 2,000 public libraries across the United States, Britain, and other English-speaking countries, established charitable trusts and foundations that continue operating today, and donated to universities, concert halls, and scientific research on a scale that required considerable ongoing effort simply to keep pace with his own fortunes, continued growth from investments even as he gave. The habit had its own particular difficulty, one rarely discussed alongside the more familiar stories of squandered fortunes. Giving away hundreds of millions of dollars thoughtfully, rather than carelessly, turned out to require nearly as much sustained attention and organizational effort as building the fortune in the first place had. Carnegie employed considerable staff specifically to manage the giving, evaluate requests, and ensure the money was reaching institutions capable of using it well, rather than simply disappearing. By his death in 1919, Carnegie had given away roughly 90% of his fortune, a deliberate, sustained habit pursued with the same intensity he had once brought to building the steel empire that had produced the money in the first place. He did not entirely succeed in dying broke. He came, by his own standard, remarkably close. J. Pierpont Morgan built and consolidated one of the most powerful banking empires in American history around the turn of the 20th century, and alongside that career he developed a parallel, lifelong habit of acquiring art, rare books, and antiquities on a scale that eventually rivaled, and in some categories exceeded, the holdings of established European museums. Morgan's collecting habit ranged widely and expensively. Old master paintings, medieval and Renaissance manuscripts, ancient sculpture and rare printed books, acquired through agents operating across Europe who understood that Morgan's appetite for a significant piece rarely came with much price resistance attached. He built and expanded a private library in New York specifically to house the growing collection, a building that itself became an architectural landmark, and by the early 1900s his personal holdings had grown extensive enough that European dealers and even some museums grew openly anxious about the pace at which significant works were being purchased and shipped across the Atlantic into private American hands. Unlike several other figures on this list, Morgan's collecting habit did not bankrupt him, in large part because his banking fortune was substantial enough to absorb even his considerable spending on art without meaningful strain, and because he treated the collection with the same long-term institutional thinking he applied to his banking work. Well before his death in 1913, Morgan had already begun the process of ensuring much of the collection would eventually pass into public institutions, rather than simply being dispersed among heirs, and significant portions did go on to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and other institutions in the years following his death. The habit that could easily have read in a lesser fortune, as pure indulgence instead, left behind a legacy considerably more durable and considerably more admired than most of the extravagant spending elsewhere on this list. The collection outgrew even his own considerable library. Very little of it was ever wasted. James Buchanan Brady, known throughout Gilded Age New York simply as Diamond Jim, earned a considerable fortune supplying equipment to America's expanding railroad industry in the late 19th century, and spent much of it maintaining a personal reputation, built around two closely related habits: an enormous personal jewelry collection and meals of a scale contemporaries described in terms that read, even allowing for exaggeration, as genuinely extraordinary. Restaurant owners and dining companions who left written accounts of meals with Brady described multi-course dinners that could stretch across hours and include multiple whole entrees consumed in quantities that struck even the well-fed elite of Gilded Age New York as remarkable. Brady reportedly maintained a standing arrangement at his favourite restaurants that involved his table being positioned a comfortable distance from other diners, in part some accounts suggest, so his considerable girth and equally considerable appetite would not draw unwanted attention from patrons less accustomed to dining at his scale. Alongside the eating, Brady wore diamonds prominently and constantly, earning the nickname that outlived him, a personal habit of visible wealth that, unlike the quieter fortunes accumulated by some contemporaries, seemed designed specifically to be seen and discussed. Brady's health, by most medical accounts written both during his life and after his death in 1917, suffered considerably from decades of the eating habit that had made him famous. Contemporary physicians reportedly warned him repeatedly about the toll his diet was taking, warnings Brady treated with roughly the same enthusiasm he brought to the meals themselves. Unlike most figures in this collection, whose habits cost them money, Brady's habit primarily cost him his health, a distinction that made his story a subject of genuine medical curiosity even at the time, and a cautionary tale of a rather different kind than most of the fortunes lost elsewhere in this list. The diamonds outlived him easily. The appetite, by most accounts, very nearly matched them for fame. Nell Gwyn rose from a childhood of considerable poverty in Restoration London to become one of King Charles II's most prominent mistresses during the 1670s, and the household the king maintained for her became, over the course of their relationship, a recurring subject of complaint among ministers already anxious about crown finances, strained by decades of civil war and its aftermath. The habit of royal mistresses maintained at considerable state or personal expense was hardly unique to Charles among European monarchs of the era, but Gwyn's household, along with those of several of the king's other prominent mistresses, drew particular attention in contemporary accounts and parliamentary complaints for its ongoing cost. Staff, housing, an allowance substantial enough to support a lifestyle well beyond what Gwyn's origins as an actress, and before that, an orange cellar in London's theatre district would otherwise have afforded her. Gwyn herself, unlike some royal mistresses of the period, retained a reputation among the London public for genuine warmth and generosity, even amid the criticism directed at the broader arrangement, a popularity that in some ways shielded her personally, even as the cost of maintaining a household continued to draw political fire aimed more directly at the king. The broader habit of funding royal mistresses at Charles court became entangled in the period's wider political tensions between the Crown and Parliament over control of state finances, contributing to a pattern of friction that would shape English constitutional developments for decades. Gwyn herself continued to be supported by the Crown even after Charles' death in 1685, per his own explicit deathbed instruction to his successor not to let her starve, an instruction that was, at least for a period, honoured. She died in 1687, having spent much of her adult life at the centre of exactly the kind of ongoing royal expenditure that quiet ministers had been complaining about for over a decade. The Crown paid for the household. History remembered her, on balance, rather more fondly than it remembered most of the arrangement's other beneficiaries. In 1988, William Bud Post III won $16.2 million in the Pennsylvania state lottery, a life-changing sum for a man who had, by his own later accounts, struggled financially for most of his adult life before that point. Within roughly a year, according to extensive reporting on his case at the time, and in the years that followed, Post was already back in debt. A former girlfriend successfully sued him over a claim to a share of the winnings, and Post reportedly spent lavishly across that first year on a private airplane, a car dealership business venture that failed, and gifts and loans to family members and acquaintances that were rarely repaid, a pattern of giving and spending that emptied a fortune many people would have assumed could comfortably last a lifetime. His own brother was later convicted of hiring someone in an attempt to kill him and his then wife, reportedly over a dispute connected to the winnings, according to court records from the case. Post filed for bankruptcy within a few years of his win, and spent much of the following decades living on a modest disability income, a striking distance from the $16 million that had briefly made him one of the more famous lottery winners in American news coverage. In interviews given later in his life, Post described the win with open regret, at one point reportedly saying he wished it had never happened to him at all, a sentiment that stood in sharp contrast to how the moment had been covered in the press when he first collected his prize. He died in 2006, having spent the better part of 2 decades demonstrating, in one specific and thoroughly documented case, just how quickly a sudden fortune can move through a life it was never designed to prepare anyone for. The number, at the time, had seemed impossible to spend through. He proved otherwise within a year. Howard Hughes spent decades as one of America's wealthiest men, having inherited and expanded a fortune through aviation, film production, and later a substantial stake in Las Vegas real estate, and in his later years developed a set of purchasing habits that struck those around him as increasingly detached from anything resembling ordinary financial reasoning. Hughes was widely reported, by biographers and by aides who worked closely with him in his final decades, to purchase entire production runs of favoured items rather than simply reordering as needed, reportedly including a particular brand of tissue and specific food products he had grown attached to, buying enough at once to last years, rather than risk the manufacturer ever discontinuing them. In 1967, he purchased the Desert Inn Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas, according to widely repeated accounts, largely because the hotel's management had asked him to vacate the penthouse suite he had been occupying indefinitely, and buying the entire property outright proved, to Hughes at least, a simpler solution than negotiating a new arrangement or finding somewhere else to stay. The habit intensified alongside Hughes' growing personal isolation and documented struggles with obsessive behaviour and germ anxiety in his final years, during which he reportedly spent extended periods rarely leaving darkened hotel rooms, his purchasing decisions increasingly managed by a small circle of aides rather than by any direct outside oversight. Unlike most figures in this collection, Hughes' fortune was large enough, built across aviation contracts, film investments and real estate, that even his most eccentric purchases rarely threatened his overall financial position in any serious way. The habit cost him comfort and connection to the world far more visibly than it cost him money. Hughes died in 1976, still one of the wealthiest men in the country, having spent his final years demonstrating that having enough money to solve any inconvenience instantly is its own kind of habit, whether or not the inconvenience in question was ever really worth solving that way. The Desert Inn changed hands many more times after him. The tissue presumably eventually ran out. Doris Duke inherited a substantial share of the American Tobacco Company fortune as an infant in 1925, following her father's death, and grew up to be described in contemporary press coverage as the richest girl in the world, a label that followed her, in various forms, for much of her life. Duke's adult habits combined 2 threads that rarely appear together elsewhere in this collection. She spent extensively and visibly on real estate, acquiring and maintaining multiple large estates across Hawaii, New Jersey and Rhode Island, along with extensive collections of Islamic art, botanical specimens, and other acquisitions pursued with genuine, sustained personal enthusiasm rather than mere display. At the same time, she directed a considerable and growing share of her fortune into philanthropy, through her own foundation, established well before her death, funding medical research, the performing arts, and environmental conservation causes on a scale that placed her among the more significant American philanthropists of her era, even as press coverage of her personal life often focused more on the eccentricity of her estates than on where the bulk of her money was actually going. The dual habit produced a more complicated legacy than the simpler stories of pure squandering or pure giving found elsewhere in this episode. Duke's personal spending on her properties and collections was genuinely extravagant by any ordinary measure, yet the charitable foundation she established, the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, continued operating and distributing substantial grants well after her death in 1993, funding causes that had little to do with the personal indulgences her lifetime spending habits are more often remembered for. She spent like someone entirely unconcerned with the fortune ever running out, and gave like someone who had thought carefully about exactly what should happen to what remained. Both habits, as it turned out, could comfortably belong to the same person. In the summer and early autumn of 1869, financiers Jay Gould and Jim Fisk pursued a scheme built on a specific and risky habit, attempting to corner the entire American gold market by quietly buying up as much available gold as they could, betting that a sufficiently tight supply would drive the price upward and let them sell at an enormous profit, once other traders were forced to buy from them at whatever price they demanded. The scheme depended on keeping the federal government's own substantial gold reserves out of the market during the buying period, and Gould reportedly cultivated a personal relationship with a brother-in-law of President Ulysses S. Grant in an effort to gain insight into, and possibly influence over, the administration's plans for its gold reserves. For several weeks through September of 1869, the price of gold climbed steadily as Gould and Fiske's buying continued, drawing in other speculators eager to ride the same rising price, a habit of speculative momentum not unlike the South Sea bubble a century and a half earlier, compressed here into a matter of weeks rather than months. The scheme collapsed on September 24, 1869, a day that became known as Black Friday, when the Grant administration, having become aware of the manipulation underway, ordered the Treasury to sell a substantial quantity of government gold onto the open market, instantly flooding the supply the scheme depended on keeping artificially tight. The price of gold crashed within hours, ruining numerous traders and investors who had been drawn into the rising price during the preceding weeks, while Gould himself, having anticipated the possibility of exactly this kind of government intervention, had already begun quietly selling his own holdings before the crash, limiting his personal losses considerably compared to the traders left holding gold purchased near the peak. Fiske and Gould faced considerable public outrage and numerous lawsuits in the aftermath, though neither faced any serious lasting legal consequence for the scheme itself. The market recovered within weeks. A great many of the individual traders who had been pulled into the corner's rising price never did. Hetty Green, born into a wealthy Quaker whaling and shipping family in 1834, built on her inheritance through decades of shrewd, aggressive investing to become, by most estimates, the wealthiest woman in America by the time of her death in 1916, a fortune large enough that newspapers of the era took to calling her the Witch of Wall Street. Green's habit, unlike almost everyone else in this collection, ran in exactly the opposite direction from extravagance. She was famous, even during her own lifetime, for an extreme personal frugality that persisted regardless of how large her fortune grew, wearing the same worn black dress for years at a stretch, reportedly moving between modest boarding houses rather than maintaining a permanent residence commensurate with her wealth, and negotiating small expenses with a relentlessness contemporaries found genuinely startling given the scale of the fortune behind her. The most widely repeated story about the cost of that habit involves her son, Edward, known as Ned, who injured his knee as a boy in a sledding accident. By the most common account of the story, retold across numerous biographies and popular histories of Green in the decades since, she delayed seeking paid medical treatment for the injury, reportedly attempting first to have him treated at a free clinic for the poor under a false name to avoid the cost of a private doctor. By the time proper medical attention was finally sought, the injury had worsened considerably, and Ned's leg was eventually amputated as a result. Some biographers have questioned certain details of the most dramatic versions of this story as it has been retold over the decades, though the broader outline, and Green's well-documented habit of extreme frugality even in matters involving her own family's health, is not seriously disputed. Green died in 1916 with a fortune estimated at somewhere between $100 million and $200 million. In the money of her time, one of the largest private fortunes then held by any woman in the world. She had spent a lifetime refusing to spend. In the story she is most remembered for, the bill came due anyway, paid by someone else. Ludwig II's castles still stand on their Bavarian hillsides, tourists filing through gilded rooms he never lived to see finished, paying, a little over a century later, exactly the money he could never quite raise himself. That is the strange shape so many of these habits took. Money spent past all reason on gold houses, jewelled thrones, tigers, castles, shoes, a single dissolved pearl. Sometimes the bill arrived as a throne lost or a leg or a life lived one step ahead of a creditor. Sometimes, decades later, the very thing that ruined someone quietly turned a profit for whoever inherited what was left of it. Nothing about any of these habits was inevitable, and nothing about any of them was entirely surprising either. Given enough money and enough time, it seems, almost everyone finds the one thing they cannot stop reaching for, whatever it happens to be. We will leave them all there, in their palaces and their debts, and let the next fortune find its own habit in its own time.